The first thing I noticed was the sound sharp, rhythmic, and deliberate. Vanessa's manicured nails tapped against the polished surface of the conference table like a metronome counting down to her coronation. She sat draped in black silk, a diamond pendant catching the late morning light streaming through the tall windows. Her chin was lifted just enough to make sure everyone in the room understood where she believed the power rested. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a glance. Instead, I let my eyes wander across the room, the deep leather chairs, the faint scent of old paper and varnished oak, the neat rows of legal folders stacked before Robert Alden. The atmosphere was solemn, but to Vanessa, it might as well have been a victory parade. Robert sat at the head of the table, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. He was the kind of man who never wasted a word, and right now, he was shuffling through the will with the precision of someone who had known my father for over 3 decades. His movements were unhurried, as if he enjoyed the tension stretching between the three of us. Vanessa leaned back, crossing one leg over the other in a show of relaxed confidence. Her perfume, something expensive and overwhelming, lingered in the air, fighting for dominance over the scent of leather. I caught the faintest curl of her lips, a private smile she didn't bother to hide. She thought she'd already won. I folded my hands in my lap, steady and calm, feeling the familiar weight of the plan I'd carried for months. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was loaded, a space I'd learned to fill not with words, but with patience. Robert cleared his throat, glancing first at me, then at Vanessa. "Shall we begin?" he asked, his voice carrying that practiced blend of formality and finality. I nodded once, slow and deliberate, my gaze fixed on the woman across from me. She had no idea the ground beneath her was already shifting. 5 months earlier, the Hamptons estate looked like it had been plucked from the pages of a bridal magazine. White tents billowed gently in the ocean breeze. Crystal chandeliers hung from silk canopies, and the air was rich with the scent of roses and salt water. My father, Edward Calloway, stood at the altar, looking years younger in his tailored suit. His eyes lit up when Vanessa appeared, gliding down the aisle in a gown that seemed to drink in the sunlight. She was flawless, every movement graceful, every smile calibrated. She touched his arm like he was the only man in the world, and I wanted to believe she meant it. After my mother passed, I'd watched my father's world shrink to boardrooms and empty dinners. If this woman could pull him back into life, who was I to question it during the reception? She worked the crowd effortlessly, remembering names, complimenting outfits, laughing at every joke my father told. She even found me among the throng, linking her arm through mine. "Kiddo," she said warmly, pressing a velvet box into my hand. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet. "For your graduation." I wanted to give it in person. I thanked her, trying to ignore the faint stiffness in her eyes. It was there for only a second, a flicker of something colder, harder before the warmth returned. The rest of the night was a blur of champagne toasts and carefully staged photographs. My father beamed, and I smiled for him, telling myself that this was what he needed, that love, no matter how sudden, could be real. But as I watched her glide through the crowd, her laughter just a shade too polished, the doubt began to take root, small and silent. It would be months before I understood just how deep it would grow. It started so quietly, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. One Sunday, I showed up to my father's house with a bottle of wine, expecting our usual dinner, only to find the dining room cleared and the lights off. The next day, Vanessa texted, "Oh, sorry. We had dinner out with friends, must have slipped my mind to invite you. I brushed it off. People forget things." Then the locks changed. I didn't find out until I stopped by after work to drop off some documents my father needed. My key, the same one I'd had since I was 16, wouldn't turn. Vanessa answered the door with an apologetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Edward didn't tell you. We had the locks upgraded for security. She didn't hand me a new key." A week later, I noticed something stranger my father's words. Over lunch, he leaned back and, almost casually, said, "You're still trying to figure yourself out. Huh, no rush. But at some point, stability is important." It was the same phrasing I'd overheard from Vanessa when she thought I was out of earshot. It happened again and again. Little comments about my career, my apartment, the way I still lived like a student. They were wrapped in fatherly concern, but the edges were too sharp. I told myself it wasn't worth making a scene. My father seemed happy. And wasn't that what mattered? But the warmth between us had cooled. Calls went unanswered for days. Visits were brief, as if there was always somewhere else they needed to be. The distance settled in like a draft you can't quite locate unseen, but impossible to ignore. And beneath it all, a quiet unease was taking root, one I tried to push aside until the night everything became clear. It was late, the kind of hour when the house should have been still. I'd come by to drop off some papers for my father's signature, expecting him to be in his study. The lights were low, the air faintly scented with the remnants of Vanessa's perfume. As I passed the hallway leading to the sunroom, I heard her voice low, but not low enough. I paused, my back to the wall, and listened. "Once he's gone, it's all mine. The kid won't get a cent." There was no hesitation in her tone, no trace of guilt. It was matter of fact, like she was confirming a delivery date. My pulse quickened, but I stayed silent, straining to hear the rest. "That's how we planned it," she went on, a small laugh curling around her words. "Everything's already in motion." I could hear the faint buzz of whoever was on the other end, but I didn't care about their voice. It was the certainty in hers that made my skin crawl. She ended the call without rushing, then stepped into the hallway, catching sight of me immediately, for a moment. We just stared at each other. Then her lips curved into a smirk. "Don't look so shocked." "Kiddo," she said, her voice rich with condescension. "This is how the world works." My first instinct was to lash out, to call her every name she'd earned, to demand she explain herself, but I didn't. Something inside me colder, sharper, clamped down on the anger. Words would give her too much. Instead, I let the silence stretch, meeting her gaze until she finally turned away, her heels clicking against the hardwood as she disappeared into the kitchen. In that moment, I understood two things she was absolutely certain she would win, and she had no idea I'd just decided to play a much longer game. I left the papers on my father's desk, the pen resting neatly on top, and walked out without another word. By the time I reached my car, the fury had settled into something steadier. I knew now that waiting would hurt her more than any outburst ever could. 2 weeks after that night in the hallway, my father called and asked me to meet him at his office. His voice was steady, but there was something in it I hadn't heard before, an undertone that made me cancel everything else on my calendar. When I arrived, he was sitting behind his desk, a manila folder in front of him and an untouched cup of coffee cooling at his side. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with work. "I saw the doctor yesterday," he said without preamble. "It's terminal." The words landed like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mind went to treatments, second opinions, miracles, but his eyes told me he'd already walked through every possibility. I swallowed hard. "What do you need me to do?" A faint smile touched his lips. "You've always been the one I could count on to keep your head. She's not as clever as she thinks." Serena. That was the first time he'd acknowledged the tension between Vanessa and me. He didn't linger on it. Instead, he reached into the folder and pulled out a crisp legal pad. "I want you to meet Robert Alden," he said. "He's been my attorney for 30 years. He knows my business, my history. And more importantly, he knows the kind of traps people set when money's involved. Robert entered a few minutes later, a tall man with sharp eyes and a measured handshake. We spoke at length about the estate, and I could see my father's mind was already made up. "We're not disinheriting her," he said firmly. "That's not who I am. But we are making sure she can't touch the bulk of it without you." Robert explained the plan. The majority of assets, including properties and investments, would go into a trust with me as sole controlling trustee. Vanessa would receive a fixed annual stipend and one property to live in, but she'd have no authority to sell, lease, or leverage any other asset. It was airtight, the kind of legal architecture you couldn't knock down without dismantling the whole structure. When Robert left, my father leaned back in his chair and looked at me with quiet pride. It only takes one piece of paper to change the ending. "Serena, let's make sure this one is written exactly the way we want." I nodded, feeling the weight of what we were about to do settle into my bones. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about preserving the life my father had built. Robert spread the draft of the will across the desk, the pages crisp and heavy in my hands. Each section was meticulously labeled, every paragraph a safeguard against the kind of ambition we both knew Vanessa harbored. My father sat beside me, quiet but attentive, nodding when Robert read aloud the key provisions. Vanessa would receive the Park Avenue residence lavish enough to appease her ego and a stipend of $100,000 a year, enough to survive, not enough to thrive. On paper, it sounded generous. In reality, it was the perfect cage. The heart of the will was the Callaway Trust. $120 million in real estate, investments, and holdings, all consolidated under my full controlling interest. Every property, every account, every piece of land, nothing could be sold, leased, or transferred without my written consent. When Robert read that clause aloud, I felt a quiet satisfaction, but it was tempered by something deeper. Many of those assets weren't just numbers, they were pieces of my mother's legacy. The vineyard upstate where she taught me how to prune vines, the Charleston townhouse she restored herself, even the old lake cabin where we'd spent summers before she got sick. These weren't trophies for Vanessa to strip apart and sell. They were parts of us. Robert tapped the final page. "It's all here. Once this is signed and notarized, no one, not even the most aggressive attorney, can move a dime without you." My father turned to me, his eyes steady. "Serena, this isn't about taking something from her. It's about keeping what matters safe. Patience will serve you better than revenge." I nodded, understanding that he wasn't just talking about the will. He was reminding me that sometimes the sharpest weapon isn't the strike, it's the weight before it. We signed the documents, the notary stamping each page with a firm thud. When it was done, Robert gathered the will into its leather folder, locking it away until the day it would matter most. As I left the office with my father, I knew the foundation had been laid. All that remained now was to let Vanessa believe she'd already won. The funeral was a parade of black suits, muted murmurs, and carefully measured condolences. Vanessa stood at the center of it all, draped in couture mourning attire, her makeup flawless, her smile faint but photogenic. She took every hand offered, accepted every embrace, and never once let a tear fall. If anyone noticed, they didn't dare say it aloud. I stayed at the edges, speaking quietly with my father's oldest friends, people who'd known him before Vanessa had even learned his name. They grieved in a way she couldn't fake. When it was over, she posed for a few lingering photos beside the casket, then slipped into the limousine without so much as a glance in my direction. By the third day, word reached me from one of my father's associates. Vanessa had been seen at lunch with a well-known Manhattan real estate broker. Over glasses of wine, she was gesturing expansively, describing which of Edward Callaway's properties she wanted to put on the market first. She didn't know the ink on the death certificate was still fresh, but the trust papers had been sealed long before. That afternoon, I went to the Park Avenue residence. She greeted me in silk loungewear, her hair swept into a perfect chignon, as though she were already queen of the empire. "I suppose you came to ask about the will reading," she said, walking toward the living room. "Don't bother showing up. You're not in it." I let her have her moment, her confidence so complete it was almost impressive. "I'll be there," I said evenly. She laughed an airy, dismissive sound and waved her hand as if shooing away a child. "Suit yourself." I left without another word, the echo of her laughter following me out the door. Inside, I could already feel the quiet click of the trap waiting to spring. The oak-paneled walls of Robert Alden's office seemed to hold the weight of decades. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, catching the dust in slow, deliberate swirls. The long conference table gleamed, each seat precisely arranged. Vanessa took her place to Robert's right, silk draped perfectly over her frame, her posture flawless. She radiated anticipation, her smile faint but steady, like someone savoring the appetizer before the main course. I sat across from her, hands folded, my gaze fixed on the polished wood grain instead of her face. Robert opened the folder and adjusted his glasses. His voice was steady, formal. As he began, small bequests came first donations to a local literacy foundation, a scholarship fund in my mother's name, modest gifts to long-serving household staff. Vanessa smiled through each one, the curve of her lips unchanging. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman indulging the niceties before the part that truly mattered. I could almost hear the script playing in her head, the lavish inheritance, the immediate control, the effortless ascent to power. I didn't speak. I didn't even shift in my chair. The silence was my ally, each passing second a thread tightening around her expectations. Robert turned a page, his eyes flicking briefly to me before settling back on the document. I could see the faintest ghost of a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. He cleared his throat and began the next section, the one that would change everything. Vanessa straightened slightly, her nails brushing the tabletop in an unconscious rhythm. She thought she was ready for what came next. She wasn't. Robert's voice was steady as he read, "To my daughter, Serena Calloway. I leave full controlling interest in the Calloway Trust, including all associated accounts, assets, and properties." Vanessa's smile froze, but she didn't move. "With the exception," Robert continued, "of the residence at Park Avenue and an annual living stipend of $100,000 to my wife, Vanessa Whitmore Calloway." A faint laugh escaped her, sharp and dismissive, but it faltered when Robert turned the page. Per the clause in paragraph 14, any sale, lease, or transfer of trust assets requires the sole written consent of Serena Calloway. Without such consent, no property within the trust may be liquidated, mortgaged, or encumbered in any form. The tapping of her nails stopped. "That's not valid," she said quickly. "He would never." Robert looked up, his tone still calm. This document was reviewed, notarized, and filed in full compliance with New York trust law. Your husband signed each page in my presence. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. I lifted my gaze from the table and met hers for the first time that morning. "Dad did this," I said evenly. "I just made sure it was airtight." Her eyes narrowed, the air between us heavy with something unsaid, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of more words. The silence was enough. Robert closed the folder, his movements unhurried. "That concludes the reading of the will." I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of the moment settle, knowing the real impact of those sentences would echo far beyond this room. The months that followed were quiet, almost anticlimactic. There were no explosive confrontations, no courtroom battles, just the slow unraveling of a life built on expectation. Her favorite boutiques stopped holding items on reserve. The cards she once waved so freely began coming back declined. Brokers who once called daily for listings now stopped returning hers. $100,000 a year was more than enough to live comfortably, but it wasn't enough for the kind of life she thought she'd secured. I let her keep the Park Avenue residence, as my father intended. It was easier to watch her pace its halls, clinging to what she thought was hers. But patience has its limits. The day she tried to rent out the guest wing for quick cash, I acted. The clause in the trust gave me every right to intervene, and I did selling the property outright. She received her stipend, exactly as the will stated, and nothing more. The last time I saw her, she was standing outside the Park Avenue gates, a single suitcase at her feet. She didn't look at me as I approached. I slowed just enough to speak. "Guess you were wrong, kiddo." Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. I kept walking, the sound of my heels fading into the city's hum. Revenge had never been the goal. My father was right. Patience served me better. And sometimes, silence can cut deeper than any blade.